from a commonsensical standpoint, in everyday contexts, we think that attention is a very, very interesting conscious phenomenon. That's the sort of naive standpoint that we all have when we describe what it's like for us to have a particular experience. I can tell you, for example, focus your attention on the last letters on the right-hand side of the slide. Or we can even think about not top-down voluntary events, but bottom-up events. Imagine you are in the Catholic University library, and suddenly you hear the fire alarm, and you react immediately. So, in order to account first for these sort of naive commonsensical intuitions, I want to start talking about a phenomenological conception of attention, namely a conception that starts from the intuition that attention is a conscious phenomenon, inspired by William James. And not only by William James, but a lot of classical psychologists and philosophers, including James or even Wundt sometimes. And some contemporary philosophers as well. I'm thinking about some ideas explored by Declan Smythes or James Statziker sometimes, that seems to suggest that there's a sort of strong commitment with this phenomenological basic intuition. So in this talk, I don't think I'm going to talk the whole hour, maybe less, but given that we have a lot of time and given that it's a workshop, I'm going to try to stop in some details so I can get some feedback. I'm going to start with this idea of what I will call the phenomenological conception of common sense. Then I will talk and review some of the main reactions, philosophical reactions, to pathological cases, specifically to blind sight. And of course, I will mention G.Y.'s case, which is probably the most well-known subject with this pathology. Then I will stop and I will address the blind sight cases based on a distinction between attention to objects, like entities in the world, and attention to regions of space as an alternative strategy to answer the blind sight objection. And I will end up interpreting some recent experiments run by Norman and Bob Kentridge at the Durham Cognitive Psychology Department in the UK that are based on non-pathological subjects that suggest that indeed, against this intuitive commonsensical standpoint, we can attend objects unconsciously. So let's start with William James mainly. So I will use the slides in Spanish because the part of the text is in Spanish. So I've got some quotations in Spanish and some quotations in English. So I will be talking up sort of Spanglish sometimes. I'm reading quotations in Spanish and talking in English, whatever. So from the perspective of common sense, we tend to privilege a subjective standpoint in which attention is mainly a process that highlights, for example, certain items or properties within the conscious stream. You have a 1912 then, Wundt. We call that physical process, which is operative in clear perception of a narrow region of the content of consciousness, attention. And then the famous quotation by William James, everyone knows what attention is. It is the taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. Focalization, concentration of consciousness are of its essence. So we have we have a lot of important elements, but I want to focus in two of them. First of all, consciousness is an essential property of attention, or you might interpret James as claiming that. Secondly, according to James, everyone knows what attention is, so maybe we can stop and go for coffee now. But of course, he's not defining attention. Otherwise, the whole hot topic right now, the philosophical reflection about attention, if there is such a thing as attention, and the empirical research on attention, which is very important right now in the labs, would be absolutely useless. So when William James claims that we all know what is attention, he's trying to capture the sort of intuitive, introspectively available account of the phenomenon. There's an interesting quotation by Declan Smythes. The quotation is in Spanish, but the main idea is that James is not talking about the proper definition, but he's saying something like, we know what is attention in a similar way that we know what it's like to feel pain. So it hurts, right? You don't need to attend a philosophical seminar or a cognitive psychology seminar in order to grasp the phenomenon in question, according to William James. This is something that we can grasp immediately by introspection. If you like, for example, the literature in phenomenal concepts versus empirical psychological concepts, we capture the phenomenon introspectively, applying a sort of phenomenal concept. There's something it is like for us to attend a particular object, for example, in the stream of consciousness. And there are further elements in James' description, which are very well known in all the philosophical literature. First of all, James describes attention as a selective phenomenon. So attention selects between competing stimuli in the visual conscious stream in this case. This idea of selection is a common ground also in all psychological and even neuropsychological research nowadays. Then attention is a contrastive phenomenon that distinguishes between, for example, a foreground and a background. So imagine that we are listening to some jazz right now. We are listening Lonely Woman by Ornette Coleman. And we focus our attention on the alt sax, the saxophone. And then we focus our attention on the drums. The idea is that when you focus your attention, you make a contrast. And that contrast makes a difference in the phenomenal experience. I'm going to use the idea of phenomenal character or phenomenal experience somehow in a non-technical way, somehow, as equivalent to the Hegelian notion of what it is like for an organism to have a particular experience. This Hegelian idea of what is likeness involves at least two interesting elements. The first element is the idea of having a qualitative experience. So there's qualitative character. And the second element is the subjective element. It's not just a qualitative experience. It's a qualitative experience for me, for you, for the organism. So there's a subjective element as well. So when I tell you, okay, if you focus your attention on Ornette Coleman's saxophone when performing Lonely Woman, you will have a completely different experience than the one you had, for example, focusing your attention on the drums before. Somehow the attention quoting Sebastian Watzel, structures the phenomenal character of the conscious experience. But these two properties, selectivity or contrastivity, if you want, are somehow secondary because they are founded based on what it seems to be the essential property according to this tradition inspired by James. The idea that attention is a conscious phenomenon. So, this idea of attention as a conscious phenomenon is present in James and is present in the literature inspired by James. And I will call from now onwards this conception the phenomenological conception of common sense. I will call it that way because I don't want to deal with James's exegesis. That might be a tricky issue because I'm not an expert on James. I'm just instrumentalizing James for my purposes. And I'm going to claim that the phenomenological conception of common sense is basically a philosophical thesis that claims that attention is essentially a mode of being conscious. Okay. If we accept that, then I think we have to accept some implications. Particularly, we have to accept some modal implications. So if we read James in a very, very strong way, we end up with a conception, which is an assumption right now, a Jamesonian assumption, that tells us that attention is essentially a mode of being conscious. I am not claiming that we have a complete story about different kinds of modes of consciousness. I'm just telling that attention is a mode of consciousness. If attention is essentially, fundamentally, if you want, a mode of being conscious, then consciousness is a necessary requirement for attention. And if consciousness is a necessary requirement for attention, then there is no attention without consciousness. You might cash out this distinction in terms of a sufficiency claim also. Attention is sufficient for consciousness. So it's a particularly interesting and particularly strong thesis. And that's the main motivation of my talk. You might think, why we have to consider once against this sort of traditional Jamesonian strategy. And I might say, very loosely, okay, because it's intuitive, it seems to be the standpoint or the starting point of every research on attention. Then it's interesting from the methodological point of view, as we will see, because we talk about attention and we based our commonsensical views about attention on the basis of introspection, first-person reports, testimony. So I can tell you, right now I'm attending that bag. Or it feels different when I attend the drums or when I attend the saxophone. And on the other hand, we have a lot of empirical research nowadays on attention, which is not based on first-person reports. It is based actually on impersonal considerations that come out of the lab, out of PET scans and stuff like that. So it's going to be very, very crucial for this talk to understand if there is a complementary role, perhaps, of the empirical research, or maybe the empirical research is mandatory, and at the end, it's part of an argument that aims to reject the Jamesonian phenomenological conception. And also for the philosophical standpoint, this phenomenological conception is very, very influential. I'm going to mention just these two examples. Sebastian Batzel. Every form of attention consists in structuring the conscious point of view of one. Or Declan Smythes, attention is essentially a conscious phenomenon. And the functional role of this conscious phenomenon is to select information and make this information accessible for the use in the control of action, reasoning, and verbal report. We have to distinguish these considerations from other considerations that claim that not that attention is mainly a conscious phenomenon, but that attention is a necessary condition for consciousness. So perhaps we can distinguish between different contemporary explanatory projects. We might call the first explanatory project, this one, the consciousness first project. So if we want to understand attention, then we need to start from consciousness, because attention is essentially a mode of consciousness. Or we might revert the order of explanation and think in the attention first project. If we want to understand consciousness, particularly perceptual consciousness, we need to start with attention. Why? Because either attention is a necessary condition for consciousness. Mack and Rock, for example, there's no conscious perception without attention. Kevin O'Regan and Alva Noe making a conceptual claim. By definition, without attending, namely without being conscious of something, the visual stream doesn't seem any way, or something like that. Or something even stronger, like Jesse Prince's Earth Theory of Consciousness. I'm thinking basically about his book, The Conscious Brain, and other later publications, in which Prince seems to identify attention with consciousness. He's not only specifying a functional role, because he seems to endorse like a kind of identity claim, and he says that attention is not only necessary but sufficient for consciousness. So consciousness arises when and only when we attend. The neural processes underlying attention are the physical mechanisms by which the neural correlates of intermediate level representations become consciousness. How do we become conscious? We attend. So I'm using these quotations just to point out these two strategies, the consciousness first strategy, which is plainly compatible with the Jamesonian phenomenological conception, and the attention first strategy, which is a different explanatory project. An explanatory project that sometimes, like in Jesse Prince's case, also appeals to a sufficiency claim. Attention is sufficient for consciousness. So this is very important and somehow help us to justify going back to James in order to discuss these issues. Okay. Let's go to a very well discussed pathology. Very well discussed, but we don't really know at the moment what is the phenomenon in question. There are different competing theories about the phenomenon. Let's start with this phenomenological conception, according to which for every person and all the things, if that person is attending that very thing, then the person is conscious of that thing. Well, some experimental data coming back to Weisskranz, 1986, and a lot of contemporary research on the hands of Bob Kentridge and Norman, focus on blind sight. Are you familiar with the phenomenon of blind sight? I mean, broadly speaking, well, that's a caricature, of course. But the phenomenon of blind sight is quite complex. Basically, I'm talking about individuals that have a brain damage or brain disability in the primary visual cortex, particularly in V1. And there's a lot of experiments with those individuals. Basically, they report, I repeat, they report not having a phenomenal or conscious experience in their blind region, because they've got a blind region. If the injury is on the left hemisphere, the blind region is on the right. If the injury is on the right hemisphere, the blind region is on the left. And that's very interesting. And particularly when we go to the lab, we realize that they report not having a conscious experience on their blind spot, blind region, or technically speaking, in their scotoma. What is really interesting is that the psychologists in charge of these experiments force them to guess about, for example, the location of a particular object or item in the visual field, which is actually within the blind field. And of course, at first they just say, what are you talking about? I mean, I might be unconsciously seeing something perhaps, but I'm not visually representing any object or item in a conscious way. I don't see anything. But guess, come on. Incredibly, in many trials, these individuals with this pathology, during what is called the Posner spatial cueing test, perform above chance, perform in the same way an adult normal perceiver without the pathology would perform. This is very interesting. And I want to focus the discussion in what Weisskranz called type 1 blind sight. Type 1 blind sight is the case in which these individuals indeed say, no, I'm not having a conscious experience on the blind region, in the scotoma. Because I'm distinguishing what is going on in type 1 blind sight, which is a quite radical phenomenon, from type 2 blind sight. I'm talking about individuals with blind sight that claim that they can feel, they have a sensation of a change or movement in the blind region. So I'm not talking about those type 2 cases. So what is going on here? There are many theories available. Of course, the cause of blind sight is the injury or the damage in primary visual cortex B1. But how we explain the performance of these individuals, the performance above chance? How we explain the reports when they are forced to guess? Some theories claim that this is fully consistent with the idea that we have two different systems. The ventral cortical system, in which is hypothetically based conscious experience, and the dorsal cortical system, in which we process online what we cannot access from a conscious standpoint. So we might say that even though these individuals cannot consciously represent the items, the stimuli, the information actually located within their blind field, that information anyways is processed, for example, directly through the dorsal stream, through some visual pathways. This is very interesting, is based on Milner and Goodale distinction between the ventral and the dorsal stream. Okay, some of these studies by Kentridge et al. With an individual GY, you can check the web. There are some YouTube videos. Are really, really surprising because they confirm that due to the blind sight, they perform similarly. I mean, in a similar fashion that we would perform doing these Posner spatial cueing tests. So that's interesting. And then we have this task. And part of the task is, okay, what do we do now? We have this phenomenon and we need an interpretation. And that's a difficult task because we got the empirical data, but we have to say something in a justified, responsible way. Kentridge somehow interpreted originally the facts, claiming that we have a sort of empirical proof that we can attend unconsciously. We can attend to objects and properties. We can select information unconsciously, and that explains the performance during the verbal reports, for example, or the conductual reports. But there are some methodological issues. It's not part of the paper, but interesting methodological issues. When you base your interpretation on direct ways of measuring the information, basically behavioral reports, verbal reports, it seems that from the starting point you are privileging source of early selection paradigms of attention. And you are ruling out from the very beginning the possibility that that person, for example, actually had a conscious experience that for several reasons cannot report. So that's an open question. And then indirect ways, empirical ways of finding out evidence tend to privilege late selection models of attention, in which indeed it's possible to have a conscious experience and not being able to report or to epistemically use that experience in the rational control of action, for example. That's very interesting. There's a big discussion in the philosophy of science and methodology right now. I guess I agree with Lavi in this point. We should take both standpoints, early and late selection strategies, direct reports and indirect reports, inferences to the best explanation and verbal reports, etc., etc. Second objection that we might use at this level is based on net Bloch's distinction between P consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, and access consciousness. And the possibility that we might have P consciousness without access consciousness, or maybe access consciousness without P consciousness. I don't want to talk about this right now, but we can go back during the question and answer session, because it's a tricky issue, and I think at least I have a general strategy to claim that if P consciousness is basically a notion that captures the qualitative properties of experience, and access consciousness is basically a property that captures the functional, intentional, cognitive properties for the rational control of thought, reasoning, and action, then we have good reasons either to think that Bloch is using a very, very, very narrow conception of what it is like for us to have an experience, which is not the issue in question, And I might claim also that we have strong evidence that it is not actually possible to have access consciousness without phenomenal consciousness if V1 is out of question in this case. I might go back to this case later. So the only strategy I will mention in this case is Jesse Prince's strategy. Prince says, no, come on. You don't have to accept the idea that we are attending to objects unconsciously. What is going on here is something completely different. We can explain the phenomenon appealing to a couple of physiological processes which are required by perception that shouldn't be identified with attention. And he talks about orienting. This is very, very technical, but basically in orienting, what is going on, if I can translate from Spanish all the details, is that, first of all, we have overt and covert eye movements. Overt because they are manifest. Covert because you fix your gaze, for example, in a target, and you move your attention. So according to Prince, we have this physiological process, and we have microsaccades that could explain in a non-attentional way what is going on. We are not selecting information, we are just mapping. And then we have, of course, another physiological process which is connected basically with the contraction of receptive camps in retinotopic areas such as V4 and V5. Okay, that's very interesting. There are a couple of objections. Wayne Wu, for example, in his recent book on attention, points out that, first of all, in the trials, in the blind sight trials with GY, the items, the stimuli, are located about 6 visual degrees from the center of the field, so the scope or the range of microsaccades is not enough to capture those stimuli. And then a second objection is that this idea of remapping or the contraction of the receptive fields in the retinotopic areas is so closely linked with attention, there are good reasons to think that somehow those contractions are implicated by attention. And even if we talk about intention to move an eye or the intention to perform a microsaccade or something like that, intention to move also is closely linked with attention. So we don't have like enough empirical data to think that we are talking about different phenomena. So I'm gonna put Jesse Prince's theory on the side right now. And I'm gonna claim that there's an alternative answer, an answer that has been explored, for example, by Chris Moll in the literature, that says, okay, hang on, wait a bit. Perhaps what is going on in blind sight cases is that subjects are attending regions of space without attending objects located on those regions. So now we are distinguishing between attending to objects, attending to properties, attending to regions of space. And of course, we could spend the whole evening talking about the different interconnections between these different ways of attending. So I'm going to put objects and properties on the object brand and regions of space as an alternative. The idea is that GY cases could be explained in terms of this distinction between spatial attention and objectual attention. And the interesting Jamesonian inspired phenomenological conception, of course, is talking about objectual attention. So, are you familiar with blind spot? Like, experiments are very common. If you drive, you might experience the same phenomena in a car or something like that. You have your blind spots. Oh, I'm so sorry. I mean, I smashed your bike. I didn't see you. You were just in the blind spot, or something like that. So you can do this experiment, follow the instructions, and after a few seconds, the black square on the right will disappear. Indeed, you will notice the disappearance. I'm not sure about the external conditions here, but it should work. So what is going on here? It's okay? Could you, well, maybe you have to take a seat over there or something. What is going on here? It seems that it is possible to attend a region of the space without consciously experiencing the objects located in that region. You might say that based on the blind spot experiment. Because the square disappears. And I can ask you, okay, do you see the square? And you pay attention to the region of space in which the object disappeared. You say, no, it is no longer there. I say, okay, fine. But you are trying to attend to the object, right? Yes, of course, I'm attending to the region in which the object was located before, but it disappeared, even though I'm having a conscious experience of the region of space right now. So you might think, that's really interesting. So perhaps what is going on in blind side cases is that people like GY are not actually attending objects, so we can preserve the Jamesonian claim. They are just attending regions of space. And of course that when you attend regions of space, somehow you facilitate the informational process of getting information of the items located in that space without processing that information consciously. So, it seems it's possible to attend an area of our visual field without attending the objects or properties presented on that area. That's the sort of alternative interpretation. So we know that in order to reject the phenomenological conception of common sense, blind cases should prove, first of all, that GY cannot experience the stimulus consciously. That's less controversial than the second claim. GY must be attending the stimulus used in the experiments. But then we have this story that forces us to distinguish between spatial attention and object attention. And we must say, no. One is fine, of course. He's reporting not having a conscious experience. But you cannot say for sure that he's attending the object. He might just attend the regions of space. So we have an alternative story, and we might think that blind side cases are not conclusive, and we need more empirical research to prove James wrong. Or we might think that this distinction, especially in these cases, is very, very controversial. So Here we have Wayne Wu, says, after all, to perform the task, the subject must issue a report about a specific object, and not about a location. It is a strange position to allow that attention gets pulled by the cue, but then simply leaves the scene when the target to be reported on appears. Rather, attention is also needed to select the target to inform the subject's report as the task requires. In many cases, such selection for tasks suffices for attention. In reporting on the presence of a target, GY thus attends to an object that he cannot consciously see. So Wu basically say, no, blind sight, I mean, is quite conclusive. Additionally, we might say, we have the verbal reports of GY. We should trust GY. People like GY can even self-attribute attentional reports. They say, I'm trying to attend to the top of the region of space. But on the other hand, going back to the methodological claim I made before, we might think everything is a bit biased because the psychologists that work on the experiment ask GY, do you see an object? Or do you see a particular stimulus? So it's going to depend on the methodology of the experiment. It's very, very controversial. But anyway, what I want to claim is that we have two options. Either we accept that there is a strong connection between spatial and objectual attention, and therefore blind sight experiments are strong enough to reject the phenomenological conception of experience, or we take the alternative strategy and we keep searching. We might keep searching for an alternative explanation because this idea of attending regions of space without attending the objects present on those regions is very intuitive. Think about Chris Moll example, 2008. He says, one can, even with one's eyes closed, direct one's attention to different parts of the space around one's head. So close your eyes and move your attention, if there is such a thing, to different spatial areas around your head. Attending now the region in front of the one and to the left, now to the region behind and to the right. If all is silent, then it may be that nothing in particular is experienced as being in these locations. But this does not prevent from being parts of the space in which one experiences oneself as oriented. And it does not prevent them being the loci of attention. Okay. So I'm going to grant that blind sight cases, at least right now, are not conclusive. And that's exactly the point in which some recent experiments, at least one of them, are very, very important. And I'll be talking about a couple of psychological experiments. The first one is already a classic in the literature. It's by Egli et al., 1994. And the second one is 2013 by Norman et al., including Bob Kentridge, of course, in his lab. And I think that together, these two experiments, which are based not on a pathological case, but in normal individuals with their perceiving capacities intact, are strong enough at least to question the phenomenological conception and at least to claim that if there is such thing as attention, then consciousness is not one of its fundamental properties. So, what is going on in the Egli experiment? The Egli experiment usually is used for the following claim. It seems that attending a particular region of the space facilitates, that's the expression that you will find in the literature, facilitates the visual processing of information about the objects located in that region. This is a sample, just a sample of the experiment. There are a lot of rectangles in different positions, vertical, horizontal. You have to focus your gaze on the cross, for example. And suddenly you will notice a Q. Usually the Q is based on a modification of the color of the edges of some of these rectangles. You will see a Q, and 200 milliseconds later, a particular stimulus. And the idea is that we have to measure reaction times. So we have to measure the reaction times under the following hypothesis. Reaction times should be faster if the cues orient attention to the region of space in which the stimulus will appear. So for example, that's the cue, and suddenly you have a stimulus here and a stimulus here, and by hypothesis, the reaction time should be faster if the stimulus after 200 milliseconds appears on that region of space, the very region of space that was cued before. And what is interesting is that these experiments seem to prove that reaction times are faster. So pay me attention. Reaction times are faster when stimuli appear in a region of space consciously perceived, in this case, as belonging to the same object, the rectangle. So for example, the distance between this stimulus and this stimulus to the original cue might be the same in space. But when the stimulus appears under the same object, the reaction time is better. So we might infer that somehow there is a stronger connection between object perception and space perception, that somehow the object determines the region of space attended, and not the other way around. So this is interesting. And then we have an additional case, which is very important because I've been talking about experiments like Egli et al. That based the interpretation on objects which are perceived at the conscious level. We all saw the rectangles. So we perceived consciously those rectangles as objects. So what is really interesting about Norman et al. Experiments is that Norman et al. Go further. They designed a fantastic psychological experiment in which the objects are not represented at the conscious level. I'm going to show you a sample. So it's a bit tricky to explain all the details, but basically you can, this is only a sample, it's more complex. You can fix your gaze and for covert attention on that point. Then you have these objects we can see these objects right now because the slide is a static slide. But during the experiment, Norman et al. Managed to change the orientation of these Gabor patches every 30 milliseconds. Like from the standpoint of an average conscious perceiver, you don't notice that there are objects over there. Just see a blurry, random pattern. So you don't experience objects consciously. If you ask the individuals taking part in the experiments, do you see any object? No, of course they don't see any object. They don't experience at the conscious level any object. So that's the basic idea. Incredibly, these experiments confirm somehow Egli et al. Predictions. So it's very different if there is, for example, a queue here, because you will have a queue also, and after a few milliseconds you will have an item. You need to report the location of the item or something like that. And the reaction times will be faster if the items appear within the limits or constraints of these objects that you don't experience at the conscious level. So if the object, if the cue is here and the object, the stimulus appears here, it's going to be faster than if it appears here or here, despite the fact that the distance within the whole pattern is the same. So this is interesting, and I think it was Chris Moll, the first one to identify that, because Norman et al. Said something, but they work in the lab, so they didn't want to push the story further. And Chris Moll said something, okay, so now we have a case which is really interesting because it's not based on a pathology. It's based on everyday cases, I mean, with normal perceivers. So if that's the case, I think we have pretty strong reasons to accept some conclusions. And I'm going to end up here right now after a couple of minutes. If we take the evidence coming from blindside cases and with non-pathological cases, then it seems we have pretty strong reasons to reject the phenomenological conception of common sense in which attention is essentially a conscious phenomenon. It seems that there are cases in which we can attend objects unconsciously. And that's fascinating. That's really fascinating. So it seems that attention is not sufficient for consciousness, and it seems that we can attend, we can select information for further processing without representing at the conscious level the very same items we are attending. So attending apparently is not a conscious phenomenon, once again. So, thank you.